40k is complex, but often the way in which we lose can be boiled down to a few simple things. Hello and welcome to Incursion Tactics. My name's Luke, and this week I will be mostly talking about why we lose, and more importantly, how we can use this information to get better at the game. I've been playing 40k for about 10 years now, running 40k events for the last 2, and lost count of the times where I've been watching a game thinking it's going to go one way, but actually it gets flipped on its head. I want to unpack some of this today so that by the end of the video, you'll have an idea of how to get ahead in your games of 40k and stay ahead. Let's get started. One thing that I don't think gets talked about enough is 40k is a resource management game. Modern 40k is less about just blasting away and killing each other as soon as possible, and has a lot of focus now on scoring and being in certain parts of the board in order to score. It's important to have certain units in our army to be able to score effectively, and lumping those units into our army isn't enough. We need to be managing our resources and ensuring we're keeping key units alive so that we can score throughout the length of the game. And a big part of this is trading, giving our opponent a piece of our army in order to take away a piece of their army. If we think of it like chess at its most basic level, if we take a queen with our pawn, that's a really good trade for us. We want to be thinking, how can we create trades that are good for us and bad for our opponents? We're not always going to be in a position where we can take our opponent's queens with our weak pawn-like units. That's an oversimplification. But where we can trade a unit that's worth a few more points than our units, that's really good. If we can avoid exposing our units unnecessarily, have an idea of the value of our units versus our opponents, so that we can dictate the pace of the trading, but at the same time not get too hung up on that unit's worth 100 points, this unit's worth 150 points, that's a better trade for me. There's also the strategic element of the trade as well. If we're scoring points by using 150 points of our unit to delete 100 points of our opponent's unit off the board, and in doing so, we will lose that 150 point unit next turn, but we've denied our opponent scoring some important primary points, that needs to be factored into the bargain as well. And that is the underlying constant tension in 40k. It feels good to dive forward, kill a bunch of stuff, roll loads of dice. It's amazing. But then if we lose half our army on the crackback, even if we've taken a big dent out of our opponent's resources, it's striking that balance and not losing an insurmountable amount of stuff on the return. Baiting is a common thing that I see people do. They'll put out a small, low-cost unit on an objective, but perhaps awkwardly positioned so that the opponent has to move some units around to get an angle to kill it, or overextend to get into combat with it, which means they're very likely to then lose that unit in the following turn when their opponent leaps out from behind ruined walls and is able to dictate multiple units into taking out that key combat unit. And so if an opponent has put something in range for you to charge or get angles on, it's weighing up, what's the cost for me going after that unit? Is this bait? Is this a trap? Am I going to lose more than I gain from wiping out this unit, which my opponent has made very easy for me to do? We're playing another person at the end of the day. They might have done something on purpose because they wanted you to do something. And the other resource we have at our disposal is command points. We want to be focusing on using them wisely, not spending them all early. It's very tempting to try and alpha strike our opponent or use all our CP to do some flashy tricks. But actually, there's a very real concept of having more information makes the spending of CP more valuable. In turns 1 to 2, we don't know how the game is necessarily going to unfold, and so using command points early can be less impactful than having more information. If we consider from turn 3, 4 onwards, using CP at that point of the game, we can see we have more information now, and in general, using command points in exchange to get victory points is a good thing. And more often than not, that's the kind of question I'm asking myself when I'm about to spend a command point. What's the upside here? What am I actually getting out of spending this command point? I might be keeping a unit alive, but is that enough? I'm not so attached to each individual unit that I actually want to waste CP just to keep them alive. But if keeping a unit alive on a defensive stratagem is then going to deny my opponent scoring points and or get me victory points, then I'm definitely incentivized to use that CP. Next up, as a surefire way to lose the game is to not play the game. And what I mean by this is to lose sight of the mission. Each mission's got different objectives and win conditions, and they're not all created equal. You don't have to get all 3 objectives in no man's land on some of the missions to score maximum points. So why try? If you only need to control 1 or 2 That's going to allow you to concentrate your force where it matters, maybe stage up behind line of sight blocking terrain pieces, and focus where you can threaten the board rather than spreading yourself too thin, trying to cover every possible angle and end up not actually protecting key parts of your force, or giving your opponent an area where they might be able to focus on one part of your army, and then if they delete that chunk, the rest of your army is out of position to be able to really retaliate. Think about the mission, and throughout the game we want to be asking ourselves, how am I scoring next turn? How am I denying my opponent next turn? What can I do to set up for the next turn? Get ball control without exposing units unnecessarily. If you're struggling with answers to those kind of questions, make some plays and then ask your opponent after you've committed. I've done this now, I'm not asking for a take back, but would you have done anything different if you were me? Would you have positioned differently? Do you think that's a mistake? That's something we could try and do. If the answers to these kind of questions are not always forthcoming, because it is hard to adapt to the game state. And that is a big part of ending up not playing the game, is if you're entering the game with a plan in mind and not able to adapt, that can be a recipe for disaster. I see people failing to adapt from the get-go. They'll deploy in the same way every game and not be factoring in their opponent's army enough in how they're setting up. And if they've got a unit with deep strike that they want to come in and rapid ingress and assault, they'll always deep strike it. And sometimes it might be beneficial to not do that. Maybe in some games it's good just to have them wandering up the board. If you've got the terrain there, that's going to hide them and allow them to move up the board, pressure the middle of the board, maybe score some secondary. That could be more impactful than unit must deep strike. So adapting to the game, even sometimes before you've started. Just want to take a moment to say thank you for watching this video. If you're enjoying this content, give the video a like. But also, if you want to see more videos like this, consider joining the Incursion. For $2.99 a month, I do an additional video every week for our members. But not only that, you get access to our private Discord. And by our private Discord, I have teamed up with Epic Flail. And so we have an ever-growing community of awesome people talking 40k, list design, old world, all sorts of stuff. We even have a very amusing meme section, so don't delay, join the Incursion today. And if you want to support the video in other ways, if you're considering buying miniatures, have a look at the video description below. There are some affiliate links that, if you use, will support the channel. A big thank you to those of you that have already done so. It makes a huge difference to these videos and lets me know that you enjoy this content and want to see more. One of the most crucial moments in any 40k game is this idea of committing the majority of our forces into our opponent's army. If you're the Tau player, this could be just positioning to blast away. If you're World Eaters, it's YOLOing up the board and getting into combat with as many units as possible and hoping your opponent stays down. It could happen turn 1 or turn 5, depending on the situation, the mission, the army you're facing, how things have unfolded, and the key is knowing when to do it. I've seen countless games fall apart where people try to push forward at the wrong time, and evaluating the battlefield is a key part of this. What are the key objectives and positions that are going to be critical to you once you've made that push forward? And if you're not going to end up safely holding objectives, then that's a bit of a red flag as to when you should be pushing forward. I see people go forward, kill a bunch of screens, end up on objectives with a couple of units, thinking, great, I own these objectives and I've killed quite a high model count of stuff, only to them, in their opponent's turn, get shot back off those objectives because the units they've placed there are exposed or just not that strong. They've now lost a lot of their key damage dealing units, and whilst they denied their opponent scoring a couple of points in that first instance, they haven't really gained an awful lot. And that comes back to the concept that I said before about trading smart. What did killing that stuff actually achieve? What pieces are you going to trade when you're pushing forward in exchange for your opponent's pieces? And if it's just you're going to run forward and kill a bunch of gargoyles and then be exposed for having done that, probably not the best idea. And generally speaking, the early turns are not always the best place to do it. If your opponent's giving you a gap and you can really exploit something turn 1 or 2, then that's different, and then you can capitalize on that, and that's great. But if your opponent's done well to screen you out so that you're not actually getting an awful lot in exchange for doing that, then patience is going to be the order of the day. And don't rush, wait for a moment where your opponent's overextended or left part of their army vulnerable, or perhaps in order for them to score points, they've had to push a unit out to an awkward position, and that's given you a way in, maybe giving you something that you can reach out to and charge, and then end up consolidating behind a ruin if there's an objective there behind a ruin, and you're then able to stage for a more aggressive play the following turn, for example. Patience is a really big part of that, and using your ability to manage resources to understand the trades you're going to make as part of that. pushing forward. What can help with this as well is a constant idea of the scores. If you can see that your opponent's going to run away with the scores, then maybe that's the time to strike. Whilst it's really useful to understand these concepts, it can be quite hard to put them into practice. And practice really is the main way in which we'll get better at trying these things out and understanding how this comes together on the battlefield. And the starting point for all of this is having a good handle on the deployment and the movement phases of the game. Both of these things are integral to setting up and mitigating against our opponent trying to use these concepts against us. And I made some videos to help with that, which you can find here. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching. Keep rolling those dice and stay tuned for more.